Hello, my name is Richard E. Brown. This is part 3 of a series on Christian heresies. It addresses the Arian heresy, which was very important from a church history perspective and continues to be important from a theological perspective. If you enjoy this video, please check out my theology blog and resource site. Here is what we have covered so far in this series. Part 1 covered the 4 natural heresies as identified by Friedrich Schleiermacher. Part 2 addressed Gnosticism with a particular emphasis on Valentinianism and its refutation by the early church fathers Irenaeus and Tertullian. We will now address Arianism, which is somewhat easier than Gnosticism because it had one primary leader and a clear set of teachings. Before diving into the full story of Arianism, let's start with a brief preview. As one might suppose, Arian beliefs were developed and taught by a priest named Arius. He believed that Jesus was created by God the Father rather than being co-eternal with God the Father. The teachings of Arius were popular with many, but vigorously opposed by many others. Things got so heated that Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to debate the issue. The council ultimately condemned Arianism, but Arianism continued to have many strong supporters even after this condemnation. Arius was a priest in Alexandria in the middle of the 3rd century. He was a very popular preacher, and one of the things that he believed was that when the Bible refers to Christ as having been begotten by the Father, it means that Christ must have been created by the Father. In the words of Arius, quote, "There was once when Christ was not." Still, Arius believed that Christ was the Father's first and greatest act of creation, and all other things were then created through Christ. The bishop of Alexandria at the time was Alexander. Alexander preached that Christ was co-eternal with the Father. In the mind of Alexander, Christ must be fully divine for several reasons. First, Christians worship Christ, and only God is to be worshipped. Second, the ability of Christ's suffering and death to fully atone for mankind's sins also requires Christ to be divine. But Alexander and Arius both held fast to their beliefs, forcing Alexander to call a council of local priests. The council condemned the teachings of Arius and had him exiled from Alexandria. Notice the picture of Arius here with the words Arius Heresiarcha, which is Latin for Arius, the founder of a heretical doctrine. However, this was only a local ruling and not the end of the story. Soon after his exile, Arius wrote a letter describing a situation to a bishop named Eusebius of Nicomedia. Both Arius and Eusebius had studied under the theologian Lucian of Antioch and therefore had similar theological beliefs. Furthermore, Eusebius was very politically connected. He contacted a large number of bishops and got their support for the Arian position, while many other bishops took the opposing side. We will now turn to Arius's letter to Eusebius. Here is the excerpt from the letter. It is actually the first part of 2 that we will examine. The letter overall is quite valuable as there are very few writings of Arius that have survived. Therefore, much of what we know about Arius and Arianism are from critics that wrote about him. You are encouraged to pause the video and read this excerpt in its entirety, but I will now read the highlighted parts in purple. How desperately the bishop attacks, persecutes, and pursues us so that he drives us from the city as if we were atheists because we do not agree with him when he publicly preaches God always, the Son always, at the same time the Father, at the same time the Son. The Son coexists with God, unbegotten. He is ever begotten. He is not born by begetting. Neither by thought nor by any moment of time does God precede the Son. God always, Son always. The Son exists from God himself. We cannot even listen to these faithless things, even though the heretics threaten us with 1,000 deaths. And so we do not here have a positive assertion of Arius's theological views, but he does describe the views of Alexander, which is summarized as God always, Son always. Arius strongly believes that these are false teachings, calls them faithless things, and even goes so far as to call Alexander and the priests that banished him heretics. Here is the second part of the excerpt. Again, you are encouraged to pause the video and read it in its entirety, but I will now read the highlighted parts in purple. But what we say and think we both have taught and continue to teach, that the Son is not unbegotten, nor part of the unbegotten in any way, nor is he derived from any substance. And before he was begotten or created or appointed or established, he did not exist, for he was not unbegotten. We are persecuted because we say the Son has a beginning, but God is without a beginning. And here it is, the core teaching of Arianism and the core issues surrounding the Arian controversy. Christ was created by the Father, and before this, Christ did not exist. And because Christ was created by the Father, he is not part of God. Arius based this belief largely on the description of Christ as the only begotten Son of the Father in the New Testament. We will now dive into this a bit deeper. Jesus is referred to many times in the King James Bible as only begotten of the Father. Only begotten is translated from the Greek word monogenes, which consists of the prefix mono and the root genes. You are probably familiar with the prefix mono, which means single, sole, or only. But what is of more interest is the Greek word genes. It is most common meaning as something that is born or something that has come into being. This is what Arius understood the word to mean in Scripture, that Christ was the only Son that the Father brought into being. Notice how the word is used to describe Christ in John 3:16 and is used in the same way to describe Isaac in Hebrews 11:17. In Arius's view, the usage of monogenes in Hebrews is clearly referring to Isaac as being born. It therefore must mean the same thing when describing Christ. But the opponents of Arius strongly disagree and pointed out that genes can also mean of a kind. Therefore, when referring to Christ, monogenes simply means one and only. This is the orthodox understanding today, and it is interesting how this has affected modern Bible translations. The top box shows the original Greek of John 3:16. It also shows the interlinear English translation. As can be seen, monogenes is translated as only begotten. This can be thought of as the most accurate translation possible in a word-for-word sense. Below this are English translations of John 3:16 and some of the most popular Bible versions. Both the King James Version and the New King James Version still translate monogenes as only begotten. This is also the translation of the 1995 version of the New American Standard Bible, which is considered one of the most word-for-word translations available. It should be noted that this 1995 version does have a footnote saying that the only begotten could be alternatively unique or only one of his kind. This said, the NASB changed its translation in 2020 to only instead of only begotten, this time with no footnotes. This is the same translation as the English Standard Version, and the New International Version translates monogenes as one and only. Let's back up a bit and recall the situation after Arius was exiled from Alexandria. He wrote a letter to Eusebius, who then gathered Arian support from a large number of bishops, creating a serious crisis within the church. The emperor at the time was Constantine. Constantine wasn't a theologian, but did not want infighting in his empire. He therefore convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to debate and rule on the Arian controversy. It was a heated debate that lasted 2 months. The picture in this slide actually depicts St. Nicholas slapping Arius at one point. Arius attended but could not directly argue his case since he was not a bishop. Rather, Eusebius himself argued for the Arian position, with Alexander arguing against. The arguments for and against essentially battle down to 2 Greek words, homoousios and homoiousios. Here are the Greek words. Homoousios means of the same substance, whereas homoiousios means of a similar substance. The Arian controversy boiled down to the question of whether Christ is homoousios with the Father or is homoiousios with the Father. It has been said that there has been no greater theological dispute in history over a single letter. If Christ is of the same substance as the Father, he must be God and co-eternal with God. If Christ is only of a similar substance, he must be a created being and not co-eternal with God. In the end, Alexander ended up winning the debate. Arianism was condemned as a heresy, and Arius, along with Eusebius, were exiled. The first version of the Nicene Creed was adopted that included the words that Christ is homoousios with the Father. Here is that section of the Nicene Creed. This translation uses the word consubstantial for homoousios, but other translations use terms such as of the same substance or of one substance. This version of the Creed also contained a last section that specifically condemned Arian beliefs. This section was later removed, but read, quote, "But as for those who say, there was when he was not, and before being born he was not, and that he came into existence out of nothing, or who assert that the Son of God is of a different hypostasis or substance, or created, or is subject to alteration or change, these the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathematizes." End quote. Anathematize in this context means that any holding these beliefs will result in excommunication. If you thought that the Council of Nicaea settled the Arian controversy once and for all, you would be sadly mistaken. Alexander died in 328 and was succeeded by the very aggressive and anti-Arian Athanasius. Meanwhile, Eusebius started courting Constantine, eventually having the excommunications of pro-Arians lifted. To make matters worse, Eusebius convinced Constantine to have Athanasius exiled. Over his life, the battle between the pro-Nicenes and Arians would have Athanasius exiled and recalled 5 times. Constantine himself became increasingly sympathetic to the Arian cause, and many historians believe that Constantine, on his deathbed, was actually baptized by Eusebius. Constantine died in 337, and there was a power struggle among his sons as to who would rule the empire. Eventually, Constantine's son, Constantius, who was pro-Arian, became sole emperor. Despite the Nicene Creed having been adopted by the Church, St. Jerome famously observed, quote, "The entire world woke up from a deep slumber and discovered that it had become Arian." End quote. This continued until 361 with the accession of Julian the Apostate, who, in an effort to harm Christianity by promoting infighting, recalled pro-Nicene priests from exile. Julian eventually died in battle. The new emperor, Theodosius, soon called the Council of Constantinople in 381, which finally made the pro-Nicene version of the Christian faith the official religion of the empire. This brings us to the end of part 3 of this series on heresies. There are 4 main takeaways. The first and most important is to understand what the Arian belief system is and why it is heretical. Put simply, Arianism believes that God the Father created Christ, which they understand is the meaning of begotten in the Bible. Arians therefore believe that Christ is not God, and there was a time when Christ did not exist. The next takeaway is the Council of Nicaea, which was convened by Emperor Constantine in 325 to specifically debate Arianism. Arianism lost the debate, and the Nicene Creed was adopted that specifically affirmed the non-Arian understanding of Christ and specifically condemned Arian beliefs. You should also try to remember some of the important figures in the Arian debate. Today, Arianism is most associated with, of course, Arius, and anti-Arianism is associated with Athanasius. But neither of these two did the debating at Nicaea, as neither was a bishop. Therefore, Bishop Eusebius debated the Arian position, and Bishop Alexander debated the anti-Arian position. Last, be aware that the Arian controversy continued for more than 60 years after the Council of Nicaea, only ending with the Council of Constantinople in 381. Thank you, and God bless.